General, I must protest this impetuous decision.
A Custer decision, impetuous. Grant calls me impetuous too. A drunkard, sitting there in the White House, calling me impetuous.
General, I implore you to reconsider. Think of the men whose lives depend upon you.
What do you think I should do, Mule Skinner?
Sir, that man doesn't know anything.
What do you say, Mule Skinner? Should I go down there or withdraw?
I had him. But this time what I held in my hand wasn't a knife, but the truth.
Well, what's your answer, Mule Skinner?
General? You go down there.
You're advising me to go into the coulee?
Yes, sir.
There are no Indians there, I suppose.
I didn't say that. There are thousands of Indians down there. And when they get done with you, there won't be nothing left but a greasy spot. This ain't the Washita River, General. And them ain't helpless women and children waiting for you. They're Cheyenne, Brave, and Sioux. You go down there if you got the nerve.
Still trying to outsmart me, aren't you, Mule Skinner? You want me to think that you don't want me to go down there, but the subtle truth is you really don't want me to go down there. Well, are you reassured now, Major?
You remember General Custer and controversy that swirled around him back in the 60s or the 70s? I wanted to start this presentation off with the General Custer thing to give a graphical example of how historians can get things wrong. I remember my dad telling me that he was just a crazy brave general who took unnecessary chances, and he seemed to know, even with the fact that historical academia was saying that he was this great man that loved the Indians. And he knew better. I think that's always existed. People just know, but they don't really say anything about it. And he was hoisted up as a hero, and he got his rank by accident. In the story of the Little Bighorn, Little Big Man, a movie that was supposedly a history comedy kind of thing, has Custer depicted closer to the true Custer than the Errol Flynn figure. I know that. The witnesses that won the battle, the Indians, were completely ignored by the historians. I don't really see any battlefield detectives going in there or anything. The Indians said that the battle lasted as long as it took a man to eat his lunch. So I don't really think you could call it a battle. Maybe it was a rout. But Custer severely underestimated the Sioux and the Cheyenne, and they had superior firepower to him. The army wanted to save money, and they had all of these bullets left over from the Civil War for these single-shot carbines that they equipped their troopers with. And the Cheyenne warriors mostly were using Henry rifles and Spencer rifles, you name it. They had a whole gaggle of weapons. They had everything from flintlocks to repeaters. They outgunned and outmanned the U.S. 7th Cavalry. Custer was probably being foolhardy. Plus, it taught the U.S. military a vital lesson that they employed in every war after that. And that is, if you send more ammunition your enemy's way than they can send yours, you'll win the battle every time. For a long time, that's the way it was. And then in the 60s and 70s, it started to come out where, the Indians were starting to be listened to. And then the battlefield detectives went there sometime in the 90s, and they cataloged all of the bullets, and they pretty much knew from the entire schematic of how the bullets were laid out how it went. And the Indians finally are listened to. It's just like myth. The ancients, our historians think that it's just a bunch of nonsense, but yet we still can't duplicate buildings that they made all those years ago. Who knows how long ago, really. That was just an example of how things can be wrong. One party that's in charge doesn't even want to listen to the other side. They say there's 7 layers to truth, to everything. And even the layer that was underneath this layer was a Cheyenne saying. The Cheyenne, the Crow, and the Sioux were the main tribes that did the fighting. And the Cheyenne saying was, the Crow got the land, the Sioux got the glory, and we did the fighting and dying. I don't know how true that is, but the Cheyennes were called the human beings because they understood that a human being is the highest form of life on the earth that we know of, but we sure don't act. How could you control 7 billion people if you are only maybe at the most a few dozen? How could you do it? Well, what immediately comes to mind is that you somehow circumvent things so that you can turn them all against each other and make them fight each other. We call that playing both ends against the middle. And the more one delves into the mainstream chronology of historical events, the more one scratches one's head as to what is up with all this. Why is all of this getting ignored? There's that word again. Ignorant. Seems to be pretty rampant in the academic circles. Have you ever heard something and dismissed it right away as being ridiculous, only to find out later that it was true, and more than likely the case? But back to my point, how would you do it? How would you be able to control 7 billion humans and you only have a couple of dozen? Well, the answer is pretty easy, and you got to leave anything about love or togetherness out of the picture. That's just lip service, while you do everything else contrary to that. I recently come across a group who is researching the work of Anatoly Fomenko. Russians are interesting because they don't march to the beat of the Western drums. They march to their own beat. They gather their own evidence. And honestly, they're more honest and forthcoming than Western historians or scientists or cosmologists. They seem to really want to know the truth in certain cases, but they have their elements to deal with too. Since childhood, it's drummed into all of our heads that the Russians are bad people. And if you subscribe to anything they like, then you're a commie rat or whatever, a traitor. It's just propaganda. Anatoly Fomenko, working with the theory our history has been drastically changed. And of course, I put on my critical thinker's cap because of what I know about the story and cosmology. Plus, my interest always gets aroused when there is a controversy. It's just a thirst for knowledge, and that may not be conventional.
For the Messiahship. Tony Bushby in his works even points out that when we're reading about the so-called biography aspect of Jesus Christ, we're actually reading about 2 individuals, not one, all mixed together. As we saw, Madame Blavatsky's talking about when we read the early Old Testament, it's two deities. We've got a Jehovah and an Elohim, and we've got the gods of different cults, all intermixed. Well, that must account for the reason why we have this wrathful God on one hand, and suddenly we have this very beneficent and benevolent and loving God on the other. Well, we're talking about more than one God. Tony Bushby says that the emperor then instructed the bishop Eusebius to compile a uniform collection of new writings to be bound together as one. Eusebius was to arrange for the production of 50 sumptuous copies to be written on parchment in a legible manner and in a convenient portable form by professional scribes thoroughly accomplished in their art. Make them to astonish, said Emperor Constantine. This was the first mention of finished copies of the Christian New Testament in the history of mankind. With his instructions now fulfilled, Emperor Constantine decreed that the new writings be thereafter called the words of God, and be attached to copies of the Hebrew Old Testament. Emperor Vespasian in the 1st century had proclaimed the entire Jewish territory the personal property of the Roman emperors, and his decision was officially ratified by the Senate. In effect, all later emperors were in control of the Jewish religion. Emperor Constantine effectively attempted to amalgamate the earlier Jewish religion with his new cult. By legal inheritance, he was also the Messiah. After Eusebius had finished drawing upon the large array of presbyters' texts, Constantine then ordered them to be destroyed by fire, and any man found concealing one should be stricken off his shoulders, that is, beheaded.
Considering all options, is it possible that a certain group were able to manipulate history and create Rome to be the bully of the world, to shine the light away from them?
Tony Bushby goes on to say, it is important to note that the format of the name Jesus Christ was not cemented down until the time of the Reformation. That is the 14th and 17th centuries AD. For in earlier times it had several renditions, such as Yeshua Christ or Yeshua Christos. Now, we saw a little earlier that the ecliptic and the celestial equator make the 4 cardinal points of the zodiac, which was the primeval Christian cross and also the pagan cross before that. But also in astrology and astronomy, there are 4 cardinal stars, 4 ancient stars that are of the most greatest importance.
This is why it is important to get your cosmology right. As I said before, it underpins everything.
And they also make a cross in the heavens. They are Aldebaran, which means in Islamic, it's a Persian word that means the eye of the bull. That's in Taurus. We have Regulus, the great red eye of the lion. We have Antares in Scorpio. And we have Fomalhaut, that's one of the fishes in Aquarius. And these 4 great stars are the precursor, the origin of the 4 sons of Horus. Horus, the god of the old world, had 4 sons. And as we've noticed, many corporate logos, there's cars that go by the name of Forester, but of course if you really examine the word Forester, it actually says 4-star. There they are, the sons of Horus. There's Osiris sitting on his throne, the sun god, attended by his 4 sons, representing the cardinal points and also representing the 4 stars. So Osiris is the sun, just like Christ is the sun at the Last Supper, and the 4 cardinal points are there. The ecliptic and celestial equator intersect at 2 hypothetical points. When the sun arrives annually at these cross points, we have the spring and autumnal equinoxes. When the sun moves 90 degrees, that's 3 months from each of these, we have the 2 solstices. This is a very important point to remember. There it is again. The 12 signs of the zodiac, the earth in the middle, the sun that moves slowly along the belt of the 12 signs, and the 4 cardinal points. When the sun reaches the summer solstice in the sign of Cancer and the winter solstice, it's in the opposite sign of Capricorn. These are at the highest and lowest annual declinations of the sun. And that's why on maps we see the tropics of Cancer and the tropic of Capricorn. All that means is that when you look on a globe, you'll see 2 meridians. One is called the Tropic of Cancer, and the other one is called the Tropic of Capricorn. Capricorn is in the south, and the Tropic of Cancer is north of the equator. All they are is the highest rising point of the sun. The sun moves to the highest point of its arc during the year in Cancer. And it moves to its lowest point in the late Sagittarius, moving into Capricorn. And that's why you have the solstices at those points. Solstice just meaning sun standing still. However, what I would like to bring out is that Cancer was known in the ancient days. This is where the summer solstice is. Cancer was known in the ancient days as the gate of birth or life. In fact, it was even believed that souls entered in through the moon or entered through the gate of Cancer to take birth through the female. Because, of course, Cancer is the female water sign. And Capricorn was known as the gate of mortality or the gate of death. So facing Cancer is Capricorn, which is where the souls were meant to leave the terrestrial sphere after their sojourn, what we call life. The Tropics of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. And this is one of the reasons, again, in a practical context, that cities like Vatican City, like London, like Washington, use this circular motif in the Piazzas, these beautiful architectural edifices, but you'll always see the gate of the north and the gate of the south. Pall Mall in London is a perfect example of this zodiological motif. Cancer is also very interesting because that's where the bear is. And the movement of the bear through the whole annual cycle makes the symbol of the swastika. You take the little bear and you position it at 4 points and it will make the symbol of, we know as the swastika. We know that America is born in July 4th. That's the sign of Cancer. That's why its symbol is the bear of the California flag, to commemorate Cancer and the northerly sign. Cancer is also very interesting because, being the northerly sign, it sits beside Leo, which is also a northerly sign. Leo is always been signified by the lion, the red lion, the ruddy lion, and the sign of Cancer, which was lunar, ruled by the moon. The most ancient symbol of Cancer was the unicorn, the pale white unicorn. So if you're a Cancer, you know that your symbol is the crab. But long before it was the crab, the symbol of the unicorn was the symbol. And that's why you see on royal heraldry, the royal families are all very aware of this. They design their cities this way, they put their throne rooms this way, and even their heraldry shows you the red lion of Leo right beside the unicorn of Cancer, the pale white moon. Now in the story of Jesus, we have, of course, the famous motif of the birthday of Jesus. It's well brought out. It's a famous story, Nativity, that the Son of God is a historical personage, they try to tell us, and that he has a birthday, the Nativity. From Fraser, we find that the custom of celebrating Christ's birth began in Egypt, being derived from the mother goddess cult there, and the Christians there celebrated it on 6th of January. Okay, so the original date of birth of the sun god from ancient times was January 6th. By the 4th century, it had become generally established in the East. The Western Church had never recognized the 6th of January as the true date, and in time, its decision was accepted by the Eastern Church. At Antioch, this change was not introduced until 375 AD. Now, the reason why the Fathers transferred the celebration of the 6th of January to the 25th of December was this. It was the custom of the heathen to celebrate on the same 25th of December the birthday of the sun, at which they kindled lights in token of festivity. In these solemnities and festivities, the Christians also took part. Accordingly, when the doctors of the church perceived that the Christians had a leaning to this festival, they took counsel and resolved that the true nativity should be solemnized on that day and the festival of the Epiphany on the 6th of January. Accordingly, along with this custom, the practice has prevailed, the kindling of fires until the 6th. Alexander Del Mar, in his fine book, Middle Ages Revisited, says, Sir Isaac Newton, in his Prophecies of Daniel, showed that not only the solar festivals, but all the other principal ones observed by the early church were Roman festivals fitted with new names. There's nothing holy about the Holy Roman Empire. There's nothing holy about Constantine. And sadly, there's nothing holy about modern Christianity that came right out of that. Now, Melito of Sardis, the 2nd century theologian, said that King of Heaven Prince of creation, Son of the eastern sky, who appeared both to the dead in Hades and to the mortals upon earth, he, the only true Helios, arose for us out of the highest summits of heaven. So wait a minute, I thought that Jesus rose out of the highest summits of heaven. No, Helios did, the King of heaven, the Son. Here's a passage. They are all thine. All those who come to thee, great and small, they belong to thee. They who live upon the earth, they all reach thee. Thou art their master. There is none outside thee. Sounds like a lovely biblical passage, doesn't it? But guess what? That's from the Louvre stele, an Egyptian hymn to the sun god of the Egyptians, Osiris.
The new chronology is a theory which argues that the conventional chronology of Middle Eastern and European history is fundamentally flawed, and that events attributed to the civilizations of Rome, ancient Greece, and ancient Egypt actually occurred during the Middle Ages, more than 1,000 years later. The central concepts of new chronology are derived from the ideas of Russian scholar Nikolai Morozov, 1854 to 1946, although work by French scholar Jean Hardouin, 1646 to 1729, can be viewed as an earlier predecessor. However, the new chronology is most commonly associated with the Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko. So there's a mathematician that's actually doing good work, born in 1945. Although published works on the subject are actually a collaboration between Fomenko and several other mathematicians, the concept is most fully explained in history, fiction, or science, originally published in 7 volumes. Seems he has a lot to say.
Is it possible that ancient Rome, Greece and Egypt were invented during Renaissance? Can it be that Jesus Christ was born in 1053 AD and crucified in 1086 AD? History, fiction or science? Describes how the contemporary chronological scale was created and by whom, with the culprits named as the 16th-17th century clergy. The well-known model of history has enjoyed the relentless attention of prominent critics ever since its creation, including respected people like Sir Isaac Newton and Jean Hardouin, the court librarian of Louis XIV, the Sun King of France.
It's probably all examples and proof. The new chronology also contains a reconstruction, an alternative chronology, radically shorter than the standard historical timeline, because all ancient history is quote-unquote folded onto the Middle Ages. According to Fomenko's claims, the written story of humankind goes only as far back as AD 800. There is almost no information about events between 800 and 1000, and most known historical events took place in AD 1000 to 1500. New chronology is rejected by mainstream historians, of course, and is inconsistent with absolute and relative dating techniques used in the wider scholarly community. The majority of scientific commentators consider new chronology to be pseudo-scientific. That's no surprise to me. The history of new chronology, the idea of chronologies that differ from the conventional chronology, can be traced back to at least the early 17th century. No, isn't that a coincidence? We'll get into the mainstream concept of the Gregorian calendar in another chapter. Jean Hardouin then suggested that many ancient historical documents were much younger than commonly believed to be. In 1685, he published a version of Pliny the Elder's Natural History, in which he claimed that most Greek and Roman texts had been forged by the Benedictine monks. When later questioned on these results, Hardouin stated that he'd revealed the monks' reasons in a letter to be revealed only after his death. Guess what happened? You don't really have to guess too hard. The executors of his estate were unable to find such a document among his posthumous papers. In the 17th century, Sir Isaac Newton, examining the current chronology of ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, and the ancient Near East, expressed discontent with prevailing theories, and in the chronology of ancient kingdoms proposed one of his own, which, based on its study on Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica, changed the traditional dating of the Argonautic expedition, the Trojan War, and the founding of Rome. In 1887, Edwin Johnson expressed the opinion that early Christian history was largely invented or corrupted in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. In 1909, Otto Rank made note of duplications in literary history of a variety of culture. Almost all civilized peoples have early woven myths around and glorified in pottery their heroes, mythical kings and princes, founders of religion, dynasties, empires, and cities. In short, their national heroes, especially the history of their birth and of their early years, is furnished with fantastic traits with a PH. The amazing similarity, nay, literal identity of these tales, often if they refer to different, completely independent peoples, sometimes geographically far removed from one another, is well known and has struck many an investigator. There's more, so check out New Chronology Flamenco on Wikipedia for the mainstream story. One of the things that Mr. Flamenco is claiming, the historical chronology of events, 1,000 years has been added to the timeline. There's a young lady, her name is Sylvia. She does a lot of videos on a YouTube channel called New Earth. And don't let her young sounding voice and accent throw you off. She's very well traveled, very smart, and knows what she's talking about. Watch this.
Some 3/4 of all historic dates found in any modern history textbook are based on a supposedly ancient book called FCB Pamphili. Since this ancient work was most important for the timings of all historical events, that is why the father of the fabricated history, Scaliger, took to the task himself. The mainstream history assures us that after Scaliger made a copy of this very ancient manuscript, the original disappeared. Our history, the way we know it, is mostly based on this book. The rest of so-called ancient sources are the books that were copied by the monks, but not just any monks, just few very selected and small groups. But to replace the entire history of entire planet is not that easy. Okay, they created the new version, but the real records, the real old books, and the memory of the people still kept the real history that needed to be destroyed. That is why, under the false flag of religious slogans, lists of banned books were created. Most of the books, all books, not just religious books, were in these lists. Very few of the truly old books were not enlisted. Basically, everything that was old needed to be burned and destroyed completely. If one book of a given author belonged to a banned list, that meant automatically, by law, that all of the other books of this particular author were banned as well and must be given by the citizens for burning. Otherwise, the citizens would be burned themselves. And along with the books, very often in the fires would end up the authors of the books as well. The clergy appointed numerous and very strict commissions that would keep a very close eye and actually had absolute control on what could be printed and what could be not, and who possesses what kind of books at home.
Military-style searches were conducted at various suspect locations, both private and public.
All borders were under very strict control for banned books. However, controlling the maps that the sailors use was a bit more difficult for obvious reasons. That is why, now and then, uncomfortable ancient maps surface. As of today, there is no scientific collection published that contains all old maps. One must work hard to find different fragments here and there, and in most cases the maps are published in very low resolution so that one cannot read the small details, and also that makes it harder to notice the places where the map has been edited in recent times. And even after all that, there were people who were skeptical about the new history and didn't want to accept it. That is why the Holy Inquisition always had fires ready at hand to burn those who did not agree. This is how our so-called history was made official, not by scientists and not by historians. In more ancient time, the forces of evil, the parasitic forces, fought humanity openly, and everybody knew who fights whom. In more recent times, they completely changed their tactics. Now they don't show their faces openly, and they only operate through a relatively small number of humans who know everything and are members of the top levels of various secret societies. The rest of the population of the earth has been rendered so senseless and so unaware of its real nature and history as a result of the fraudulent propaganda of the parasites, which has been reshaping our views for many centuries, that most of us have become not people but sheeple, blindly following our so-called elected leaders. Although social surveys from all over the world all point to the fact that most of the people on this planet consider their government leaders to be total scam and fraud and criminals, still those very same people watch TV every day, TV which is censored by that same honest government. And these very same people believe the school books, although these school books have been instituted as true by that same government. The social institution of a country or a state developed at this point of time when the parasites managed to convince certain group of people to go against their own brothers. Then the need appeared for those groups to fence up parts of the earth as their own and call them states and countries. All this is described in the Vedas as the beginning of the dark ages of Kali Yuga. Before that, there were only provinces of the great empire of the survivors. And even that so-called empire was not an empire the way we imagine it nowadays. It was not a country that kept its citizens like slaves, like the modern countries. People were free and they owned the land they were born on. Finally, sometimes in the 16th and 17th century, the parasites managed to corrupt a group of the humans on the territory of Western Europe, and those started carrying out their plan of creating countries and states that were absolutely independent from territories that abided the law of goodness, the laws brought to them by the survivors or those educated by them directly or not. The parasites managed to appoint their own people, which were rebels and insurgent kings, who manipulated the public opinion with lies and false religion-based slogans. According to the law of that time, kings who did not have proper right to the throne, who were insurgents, they had to be punished by death. That is why these newly appointed rulers desperately needed a new history that will make their claim to the throne seem legitimate. All this was centrally orchestrated by the parasites, and that is why a very similar scenario happened almost in each and every European country. And that is when Scaliger was ordered to create a new history that would be convenient to the insurgent rulers, who in exchange for being placed on the throne by fraud, vowed in loyalty to the dark forces, who eventually would carry through them warfare against the citizens of these countries. The newly fabricated history at that time was very close and similar to the real events that happened. However, the empire of the survivors and their glorious past was absolutely excluded from this history. Not only the memory of the empire was completely erased, but events that, although distorted, were still connected to it, were artificially, fraudulently sent away to the faraway past, and thus made look even more unimportant and irrelevant to the new historic reality that was imposed upon the people somewhere in the 16th and 17th century. The Society of the Flemish Jesuits issued 53 thick volumes with so-called ancient books that conveniently disappeared in various library fires after the copies of them were made by these Jesuits. Another big center of the so-called copy-making was the order of the Benedict monks. It is a well-known fact mentioned in those thick volumes themselves and accepted by mainstream historians that the monks were not merely making copies. They honestly confessed, we are also correcting the books so that they will fit the new ideas of the 17th century. And actually that is one of the best scenarios. In some cases there was no ancient text at all, and compositions that were written in 16th and 17th century are now quoted as ancient works. A huge collection of so-called ancient books whose originals conveniently and selectively burned in library fires was published by these Benedict monks, and this collection contained 221 volumes of Latin works supposedly belonging to ancient Romans,
and not to mention 161 volumes supposedly written by ancient Greek authors.
if you think that all monks of that time were innocent, godly creatures who could not be susceptible to any corruption, please follow the links about the monks in the description of this video. I promise you will not regret. Let's get into the details of how the history of a full planet was shifted, for example, with 1,000 years back in time. In the Middle Ages, people used to write years in a different way, not the way we write them now. There were two ways in the Middle Ages to write the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ. One was Jesus, and the other one was Christos. And when people meant that a certain event happened 300 years after Jesus Christ, they placed an I in front of the number of the year. An alternative version was to place the letter X, and that originated from the name Christos, because that is how, till nowadays, the Slavic people call our Savior Jesus Christ. For example, Ludovici Elsevier is considered by the mainstream historians to be a Renaissance publisher. However, as we can see on their own emblem, the year is 595. Before this year, we see the letter I and a dot after it. This is obviously not the number 1. Another example, according to the mainstream history, this is 1521. However, if you pay attention, this is clearly the letter I. This is not the number 1, and it is separated with dots. Another example, this is interpreted nowadays as year 1656. However, we can see that it actually has the letter I instead of 1, and the year written is 656.
There were different handwriting styles for writing the letter I. Here is another one from Germany. This is year 658. However, nowadays it is interpreted as 1658.
This is from Nuremberg, Germany, and again, there is no doubt that this is year 699, and there is a letter I in front of it. This is not the number 1. 1 was never written in this way. While the previous writing was before the introduction of the ideas of Scaliger, this is the same location, but the paintings are from the 18th century. And here we see how the letter I has been substituted with the number 1, and in this way the history was prolonged with 1,000 years. There are endless examples that this is not 1, it is the letter I. In some cases, the letter I, or in Slavic the letter X, was completely omitted. Like for example, on this map, the cartographer absolutely clearly writes that this is something referring to year 740 and 750, and yet the mainstream historians conveniently place it in year 1740 and 1750. And this is not the only such example. An old emblem of the city of Vilnius. It is absolutely clearly written on it, 7th century, and yet according to the mainstream history, this is city of the Middle Ages. Thousands of stone monuments are found on the Balkan Peninsula. They are called steci. Often they are classified as mysterious. That is a graceful prelude, hinting that they would not be included in the history. And why should they? They have some sort of dates written on them, and they don't fit in any calendar. Or at least any calendar that normal mortals like ourselves are supposed to inquire into. And it seems the calendar used had a record of 7,000 years. That number will come up again when we discuss the Book of Veles, which seems to be an authentic, very old book that survived the medieval burning. A book which provides some details about the advanced cultures as far as 7 or even 20,000 years ago. But although the Book of Veles is included in the curriculum of some of the courses offered by certain European universities, still we're very far from replacing these Caligarian fantasies taught in schools with something that has much greater chances to be the truth, like the Book of Veles. Still, children in school are left with the impression that 7 or 20,000 years ago, the most sophisticated idea that the man could come up with is chasing a wild hog with a stick. Here is a decree from Copenhagen. At the time when the new calendar was introduced, people were simply obliged to stick to it. They were threatened with heavy fines in case they tried to use the old calendar. In his books, Anatoly Fomenko provides examples that similar decrees were issued so that the local names of various villages, towns, and areas are changed. Because once the actual historic name of a given place is erased, is lost, then even if somebody finds a true historic record in the future, they won't be able to figure out where did the given event take place. Similar decrees were issued also about certain historic events. Whenever something happened that was very uncomfortable for the history fabricators and people saw it, there was a decree, a law that told people that actually something else happened, and if you talk about what you saw, then, of course, the heaviest punishment. At this point, you probably wonder, but how did it work in reality? How did the common people, for example, in year 600 after Christ, all of a sudden start thinking that it is now 1600 after Christ? Actually, the common people didn't even understand what happened because, conveniently, exactly at that time, the calendar was changed. The new Gregorian calendar was introduced and everything was set to the so-called correct dates, and because it was all done centrally on paper, the common people on the street did not understand what's going on at all. In this way, the history the way you know it appeared. It was not created by historians, but by illusionists, trickster, circus-style magicians. However, there were educated people as well, and they figured out the scam. One of them is the famous physicist Isaac Newton. Somehow they conveniently miss to tell us that he was a chronologist as well. He was persistently arguing that the history of the kingdoms of Egypt has been artificially sent to past with 1800 years. The history of ancient Greece sent artificially back to the past with 534 years, and the history of the Roman culture sent back in time artificially with about 1000 years. Those who are further interested can find more detail in his book Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended. Jean Hardouin was one of the most educated men of his time, and he also argued against the validity of the Scaliger history. He was a royal librarian, and he found out that the Scaliger history was founded on books that are not genuine. Actually, the list of scholars who doubted the genuineness of the theory of Scaliger is very, very long and continues to get longer nowadays very quickly. I have included it for your reference in the description of this video, and I would highly recommend that you have a look at it. There are many contemporary scholars listed that also maintain their websites. Some of them could be in your native language. But the 1000 years shift back in history was not the only shift. Actually, it was one out of the many. Local regional shifts of the histories of individual countries were also needed, and it all depended on what kind of forgery they can do to misplace the particular regional events in a way that people will naively believe it. Let's see one example. This is a document by the famous writer Lermontov. It is used as a proof for dating historic events. It is shown in the textbooks a very low resolution. There are dates indeed on this document, and it is actually an authentic document with the authentic writing of the famous author. However, if you pay a close attention to the numbers used to write the years, you will notice something strange. The number 3 is very unusual in both cases. If we see other documents of Lermontov, we can notice that he writes 3 in a completely different manner. It is becoming pretty obvious that the 7 has been made artificially to look like 3, and in this way a given historical event has been sent back in time with 40 years. This is how our so-called history was fabricated. Sending events back in time is extremely convenient for the parasites. It creates the illusion that things have always been like this. It creates the feeling of helplessness in the common people. They feel that they are being oppressed and manipulated. However, the authority of the parasites, represented by our rulers, so-called elected rulers, seems strong and long established. Not only the bloody parasitic phase in our history seems stronger and longer, but also the times when people were actually free seem even more distant and more elusive, as if they never existed. I have traveled a lot in my life, and in all countries, people are not happy with their rulers. They do not feel that the presidents and the governments are representing their real will. And yet they feel powerless to do anything because they think that it has always been like this. One of the main purposes of this video is to make known to people, no, it was not like this always. And the times when we were free are much, much closer than everybody would expect. Mainstream history assures these are nothing else but devious, evil institutions created by the parasites with the sole purpose of organizing suicidal wars amongst people.
For example, scientists, Americanologists like Leonard Adam, Carl Gense, Paul Rivet, Jose Imbellione, and many others, studied the Asian American parallels in art. They observed clear similarities in the motives, ornaments, and stylized design of cultural artifacts between East Asia on one hand and the northwest coast of America and Mexico on the other.
The similarities between the styles were too close for them to develop independently, just like that by chance.
Later on, German and Austrian anthropologists who created the theory of the Kulturkreis, or culture circle or cultural field, people like Grabner, Schmidt, Ankerman, Cooper, and others
tried to prove that the cultures of all the nations around the globe originated from 7 or 8 successive waves of migration of a gigantic scale emanating from a certain mysterious center which should be located somewhere in Europe or Asia.
And these anthropologists concluded, unfortunately, nearly all of the parallels that we presented are of no use, as the chronological gap between them spans over many centuries. If, let's say, the lotus pattern from Amaravati, India, date to the 2nd century BC, their Mexican doubles from Chichen Itza were created somewhere around in the 12th century AD. In Cambodia, the step pyramid design appeared for the first time only in the 10th century AD. whereas in Mesoamerica that happened in the early 1st century BC.
And it was only the mistaken Scaliger chronology which hindered these historians. Their observations about
The funny thing about doing research is that the more you research something, like that poster says, the more crazy you look to ignorant people. I don't mean ignorant in a dumb sense, I just mean ignorant in a sense that they don't pay attention. Your average person would think any of this stuff is in left field. They just don't know any better. And that was probably the same case back then when they brought the new calendars out. I mean, this is totally feasible. It's in line with so many other things, too. It may be the reason why some people think that Velikovsky is wrong, but it turns out that he's not. This next guy that's going to talk for a few minutes, his name is Gunnar Heinzen, and he is finding the same results.
Like this, we are in a period 600 years later in my chronology. That's a shorter one by 700 years, and 1,300 years later in mainstream chronology. You get an impression how far-reaching the catastrophe had struck. Here we see something even earlier from 70 BCE. That's the so-called mechanism of Antikythera, and it was an instrument for predicting astronomical positions, eclipses, and the cycles of the Olympic Games. So this is what you see in essence in the museum. I took the photo last month, and this is a reconstruction of this instrument, and it could show you the position of every planet, the sun and the moon in the sky. This is the kind of knowledge that we lost. And the loss of this knowledge brings me, or at least you, to the question, so how was a return to counting of the years managed? Now, I believe in a very simple one. I'm not in favor of falsification, of faking, of just creation out of the blue sky. I think when the catastrophe shook somewhere around the 930s, there was no scientific activity up to the 970s, 980s, maybe longer. Then someday people would start counting the years again. And what did they know for sure was they were after Christ, that they understood. And I think they decided to choose a year as a new year one. And this year one is turned later in the year 1000. And why 1000 years? They might have thought, because in the Revelation of John again it is said that after 1,000 years Christ and the devil in the valley of Armageddon will battle out the final fight in a major catastrophe. And maybe, it's a speculation, this catastrophe of the 10th century was seen as this, after 1,000 years, the devil and Christ are fighting it out. And so they had a basis for a year one. And only later arrived the desire to fill these 1,000 years with history. And that's when the composition began. So the authors had the very few sources on their table, and they had to put them in a sequence. Even in actuality, they lived in parallel. And this brings me to a few questions my son has asked, and I will focus on Christianity. The most important figure of Christianity is Paul the Apostle, Saul of Tarsus, a Jew from Tarsus. And he directed a radical movement all the way from Israel through Asia Minor to Greece and Rome without non-Christian sources ever mentioning him. It's a major problem in Christian history that the most important character, Paulus, is not known outside of the Christian books. But there's something interesting. 700 years after Paul, there's a major movement they call themselves the Paulicians, the followers of Paul. And they are in Asia Minor. They are right there where Paul was traveling and founding his churches and writing his letters to. And they are persecuted. They are killed. So there was a movement following Paul. And what is interesting in this movement, in the 8th century, they are still not Trinitarians. They still only believe in God. They don't think that Jesus or the Holy Spirit are godlike. And that's the theology of Paul. Paul didn't believe in Trinity, so he did not consider Jesus as a God. He only considered God as a God. So we have here two very similar movements side by side, but now separated by several hundred years. And if you bring back the sources used to fill 1,000 years from the vertical into the horizontal, suddenly you get real stories, you get real narratives. So here is Paul, and here is his movement. Another question is the most famous figure that will be the end of the lecture, King Arthur of Camelot. Everybody has seen movies about King Arthur of Camelot, and what do the historians tell us? John Myers, one of the leading British archaeologists of the last century, no figure on the borderline of history and mythology has wasted more of the historian's time. And if you write to the museum in the city of Camalodunum, you think it sounds like Camelot, Camalodunum, it's Colchester, and you ask them, isn't there a relation between King Arthur and King Atze of Camalodunum? They say, no, that's impossible. What do they say? Eastern England lay in the heart of the region first occupied by the Saxons, so cannot have been the area in which Arthur operated. Acting as a military leader of the Britons, Celtic, indigenous Britons, the invading Saxons, any historical Arthur would have had to have been operating outside the area of primary Saxon settlement. So they believe that all these areas were full of fully armed Saxons, and so Arthur could not have operated there. But you remember in the lecture that in actual fact, there's nothing. There's not even agriculture for the Saxons from 400, 500 to 900. So Saxons were there. And what is interesting in the Saxons is that they have pottery from the late Latine period, 1st century before Christ. And this is the period of Atze of Camalodunum. He lives in the 1st century BC, and he has this pottery and he has his coins. And here's the name in Greek on his coins, A-T-H-T-H, Atze. It's called Atze. So it's Atze of Camalodunum. And now that you understand, he shares the same pottery with the Saxons that are dated to the time of Arthur, but are actually some 700 years earlier. What happened? When Julius Caesar attacked the British Isles in the 1st century BCE, he was not alone in trying to conquer the British Isles. He was competing with the Germans from the areas of Hamburg, Bremen, Flensburg. They were much closer, they were much better equipped to take the islands than the British. So they were fighting each other, and the local people, the Celtic, the Britons, they were in between. And they made an alliance with the Romans to fight off the Saxons. Thus, when Arthur of Camelot, who is Atze of Camalodunum, was fighting in the 1st century BCE, he was defending his own land. The Saxons were trying to take it. They had not yet settled there. They were trying to take it. They took it. He lost the battle. So we have another explanation here. And the final question of my son, it's one of the major enigmas of Jewish history. Ashkenazi Jews, they begin in the High Middle Ages, after 930 Common Era. Later they move to Poland, everywhere else. And the problem is that in the early Middle Ages, in their original area, in Germany, Belgium, France, in this area, there is no archaeological evidence for Jews from the 8th to the 10th century. So there's a hiatus of 300 years before the High Middle Ages. So they say if the Ashkenazi Jews begin here, and there are no Jews whatsoever in synagogue architecture for 300 years, they have nobody who could have been their forefathers. We have the same situation like in Jerusalem, where the Crusaders massacre Jews and Muslims, but in the stratigraphy of Jerusalem, you do not have Jews before this massacre occurs. So now when you understand that the Antiquity, late Antiquity, and early Middle Ages periods are not chronologically but stratigraphy like this, then all the hard evidence for Jews in this period belongs also to this period, where supposedly there is no hard evidence, which means that the Ashkenazi Jews are immediate followers of the Jews of the period that is now divided in Antiquity, late Antiquity, and early Middle Ages, but in actuality is one. Thank you for your attention.
The Gregorian calendar. It's aptly named. The original goal of the Gregorian calendar was to change the date of Easter. In 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII introduced his Gregorian calendar, Europe adhered to the Julian calendar, first implemented by Julius Caesar in 46 BC. Since the Roman emperor's system miscalculated the length of the solar year by 11 minutes, the calendar had since fallen out of sync with the seasons. This concerned Gregory because it meant that Easter, traditionally observed on March 21st, fell further away from the spring equinox with each year. Leap years don't really occur every 4 years with the Gregorian calendar. The Julian calendar included an extra day in February every 4 years. But Lilius, the Italian scientist who developed the system Pope Gregory would unveil in 1582, realized that the addition of so many days made the calendar slightly too long. He devised a variation that adds leap days in years divisible by 4, unless the year is also divisible by 100. If the year is also divisible by 400, a leap day is added regardless. While this formula may sound confusing, it did resolve the lag created by Caesar's earlier scheme. Almost. The Gregorian calendar differs from the solar year by 26 seconds per year. Despite Lilius' ingenious method for syncing the calendar with the seasons, his system is still off by 26 seconds. As a result, in the years since Gregory introduced his calendar in 1582, a discrepancy of several hours has arisen. By the year 4909, the Gregorian calendar will be a full day ahead of the solar year, and by then we will be ancients. Some Protestants viewed the Gregorian calendar as a Catholic plot. Though Pope Gregory's papal bull reforming the calendar had no power beyond the Catholic Church, Catholic countries, including Spain, Portugal, and Italy, swiftly adopted the new system for their civil affairs. European Protestants, however, largely rejected the change because of its ties to the papacy, fearing it was an attempt to silence their movement. It wasn't until 1700 that Protestant Germany switched over, and England held out until 1752. Orthodox countries clung to the Julian calendar until even later, and their national churches have never embraced Gregory's reforms. Britain adopted the Gregorian calendar sparked riots and protests, maybe. According to some accounts, English citizens did not react kindly after the Act of Parliament advanced the calendar overnight from September 2nd to September 14th, 1752. Rioters supposedly took to the streets demanding that the government give us our 11 days. However, most historians now believe that these protests never occurred and were greatly exaggerated. On the other side of the Atlantic, meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin welcomed the change, writing, "It is pleasant for an old man to be able to go to bed on September 2nd and not have to get up until September 14th. Before the Gregorian calendar's adaptation, the English New Year began on March 25th, or Lady Day. Julius Caesar's calendar reform of 46 BC instituted January 1st as the first day of the year. During the Middle Ages, however, European countries replaced it with days that carried greater religious significance, such as December 25th, the anniversary of Jesus' birth, and March 25th, the Feast of Annunciation. The latter, known as Lady Day, because it celebrates the Virgin Mary, marked the beginning of the year in Britain until January 1st, 1752. Flamenco is a supporter of drastically revising historical chronology. He has created his own revision called New Chronology, based on statistical correlations, dating of zodiacs, and by examining the mathematics and astronomy involved in chronology. Flamenco claims that he has discovered that many historical events do not correspond with the dates that are supposed to have occurred on. He asserts from this that all of the ancient history, including the history of Greece, Rome, and Egypt, is just a reflection of events that occurred in the Middle Ages, and that all of the Chinese and Arab history are fabrications of the 17th and 18th century Jesuits. He also claims that Jesus lived in the 12th century AD and was crucified on Joshua's Hill, that the Trojan War and the Crusades were the same historical event, and that Genghis Khan and the Mongols were actually Russians. As well as disputing written chronologies, Fomenko also disputes more objective dating techniques, such as dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating. His book includes empirical statistical analysis of narrative material and its application in history, fiction, or science. Most Russian scientists and worldwide historians consider Fomenko's historical work to be pseudo-scientific. Well, that doesn't surprise me. In fact, you could use them as a reverse barometer for what they're saying. That in itself makes me think that there's something going on that makes them very uncomfortable. When they do that, that's the same sign you get all across the board, that they're acting out of a knee-jerk reaction of fear. Because if they were as confident in their theories as they say they are, then they would welcome any challenge to their information. But this is a usual tactic. They criticize and, stick them with the label of pseudoscience, or, just put it in the mystery bag and we don't have to look at it. They don't like new information because it threatens their bank account. And they probably have philosophy of, why should I look at that and give up my home and car and have to go back to school and learn the right thing? I'm going to look into this. This looks pretty ripe for the picking. It looks interesting.
They will hate it.
Americans.